so much. That welcome feels like welcome to the homegirl, so thank you. Thank you. There's no place I would rather be, and I'm so grateful for the opportunity not only to be here, but to be here specifically with you and the listening that I know exists in this room. I'm very much a product, professionally and personally, of the kind of conversations that occur here at Multiversity. And Multiversity, all of the groups that meet here, the kind of activities that occur here, represent a very American phenomenon. Because we at our best generate new ideas. We at our best, the national psyche is such that we incubate new things and new ideas. I was interviewed by a religious scholar who talked about the generative imagination. And this country was born of the generative imagination. The reason I'm running for president of the United States is because we really need to generate. I want to talk to you tonight about the narrative of our history, what that has meant, what it hasn't meant, and what that means for all of us today. You know, when this country was founded, Thomas Paine said, we have it in our power to start the world over again, to begin the world over again. And that was not only the belief, that was not only the yearning, that was not only the aspiration, that was the manifestation of the people who founded this country. So I want to go back with you, if I might, to what happened in 1776. 1776, with the writing and the signing of the Declaration of Independence, America created the mission statement of a new nation. And that mission statement is extremely important. It's important in a nation just like it's important in a business or in anybody's life. That's why businesses talk about it a lot today. What is our mission statement? Because we know that when there is an agreement, what are the principles? What are the ideas? What are the values of this excuse me, of this system? And then everyone involved in the system agrees there's great power, because when an idea is shared, it is stronger and it becomes a field out of which new possibilities can emerge, because there's an agreement on some deep level. Now, what has happened is that in our generation, we have lost our psychological and emotional connection to America's mission statement. And these are principles which might be inscribed on marble walls somewhere. They might be written in parchment, put behind glass, and we send 8th graders to Washington so that we can say, well, my 8th graders saw the Declaration of Independence. But if those principles are not alive in our hearts, then they fail to live at all. They lose their moral force. They lose their moral authority. In the Jewish religion, it is said that every generation must rediscover God for itself. Every generation of Americans must rediscover the rambunctiousness. We must rediscover the spirit of rebelliousness, healthy rebellion. Every generation must rediscover the healthy birthing and incubation of new ideas, which, as it turns out, is an ongoing process. You know, if you don't take care of your marriage, don't go being surprised if you start losing your marriage. If you don't take care of your business, don't go being surprised if you lose your business. If you don't take care of your health, don't go being surprised if you start losing your health. Everything which is good in life must be tended to. That is what life is. It's never a done deal. And democracy, particularly as it turns out, isn't either. But let's go back to what happened in 1776, because we need a deep intellectual, emotional, and psychological understanding of what happened there and what didn't happen there. We are empowered by the knowledge of our history, just as we're empowered when you go to therapy and you want to know the history of your family, the history of your tribe, the history of your people, the history of your religion, the history of your sexuality, the history of your ethnicity. We need to clue in, we need to be cued in on a deeper level to the history of our country, because without an understanding of where we came from, as Americans, just like as anything else, if you don't have a deeper understanding of where you come from, you don't have the deepest understanding of who you are, and you don't have the deepest understanding of who you need to be in order to move this thing forward. Now, in 1776, these men created the possibility of something that did not exist before, that was in complete repudiation of the aristocratic system that had dominated Western civilization for centuries. Because that aristocratic monarchical situation was one in which, and if you think about it, we were taught these things as children. I remember being taught as a child that the sun god, the kings of France, for instance, he was called the Sun King. It was the idea of the divine right of kings. the divine right of kings. The whole idea was that God had given power to the king. And maybe the king would share it with the queen, or maybe it was a queen, but God had given the power to the monarch. And then the power was to be shared with a few of his or her rich friends. And they were entitled, and only they were entitled. They were entitled to the land, they were entitled to education, they were entitled to the means of material expansion and self-actualization. They were entitled to wealth, they were entitled to create more wealth. They were entitled to bequeath to their children what they had earned. Nobody else was. With the founding of this country, we completely repudiated that paradigm. We completely started the world over on a new idea. And that idea was not that God just gave power to the king, but that God created all men equal. It does not say God created all men equal, but it does say all men were created equal. And it says that God gave all men the inalienable rights of life and of liberty and the pursuit of happiness, which is an extraordinarily modern concept. That to have said that in 1776, everybody has the right to pursue happiness. And then it says two other things that are of great relevance. It says that governments were instituted to secure those rights. And then it completes the whole thing with, if the government fails to do that job, it is the right of the people to alter it or amend. Because the men who established those principles, who wrote them, and who risked their lives to sign that document. Because if the War of Independence had been won by the British, those men who signed that document would have been executed as traitors against the King of England. But out of the 50-some-odd people who signed, 41 of them were slave owners. So that's where it all started. This characterological dichotomy that has always been who we are. That on one hand, we are founded on the most aspirational, the most enlightened, the most life-changing, the most birth-giving, the most self-actualization promoting ideals that have ever founded, have ever formed the core of the foundation of any country on earth. Principles which not only give us our rights, but which are our responsibility to uphold in our time, to protect in our time, to nurture in our time, to expand in our time, and to give to our children in even better shape than we found them. But at the same time that we are that, and at the same time as every generation, including ours, has had people who are ablaze with love, a radical sense of what those things mean, there have also been, throughout our history from the beginning, including now, forces which have represented the most violent transgression against those principles. We have always been both. We have always been both, and every generation in this ongoing narrative, like a novel that never ends, every generation writes its story. And it is our time to choose what is the story that we will write. Now, if you look at the narrative over time, we do tend to move in the right direction. So when we hear a line like, all men are created equal, we get that that's not supposed to just mean white people. It's not just supposed to be men. It's not just supposed to be this group or that group. And at our best, that's what we've stood for. We had slavery, but then a generation rose up and responded with abolition. We had the suppression of women. Generations have risen up and responded with two major waves of feminism and the women's suffragette movement. We had institutionalized white supremacy and segregation, and a generation rose up with the civil rights movement. We had the denial of the right to be happy through the institution of marriage of gay people, and then a generation rose up with the marriage of gay people. We have had genocide and cultural annihilation of Native Americans, and even now, generations are standing at standing rock. In not one of those cases did the government say, we'll do it. In not one of those cases, the government did not stand up and say, let us free the slaves. That's not what happened. The early evangelicals and the Quakers, representing the people, rose up. In other words, the people stepped in. And the same is true with the suppression of women, the conventional politics of that time. The government did not wake up and say, let us give women the right to vote. It was the women's suffragette movement. In other words, the people stepped in. And with civil rights, it wasn't like the conventional political status quo of that time said, let us end segregation. Let us end institutionalized white supremacy. No. It was a Baptist preacher named Martin Luther King Jr. and the Southern Christian Leadership Conference. I point out the spiritual bases of so many of these things. In other words, the people rose up and the people stepped in. In other words, ladies and gentlemen, it is important in every generation that we identify our problems. It is important that we identify our problems today, just as it is important that we identify the problems of our past. But we should identify with the problem solvers of our past. Yeah, we have the legacy of slavery and suppression of women and cultural annihilation in this country, but you and I are the heirs of a great legacy of the abolitionists and of the civil rights workers and of the women's suffragette. And let me tell you something, nothing that's happening today is all that new. It's all that same stuff. It's just the aristocratic paradigm in whatever way it presents itself, coming back around again. We're entitled, you're not. And today, it's not a specific institution like slavery. It's not a specific institution involved in the suppression of women. It's not a specific institution such as segregation. It is a mindset. It is a sociopathic mindset that has gotten a hold of our economy. It has corrupted our government, and it hijacked the moral value system of the United States. It is a mindset. That says that corporate profits are the new God. And that all public policy, somehow, that there's something all right about the fact that government policy should do more to advocate for short-term profits for huge multinational corporations than to advocate for the safety, the health, the well-being of the people of this country, the people of this world, or the planet on which we live. Now, ladies and gentlemen, let me tell you something. Whether it was an evil institution or just a sociopathic mindset, whether it is represented by genuinely immoral forces or simply amoral forces, whether it is represented in its form by the short-term profits of health insurance companies or big pharmaceutical companies or gun manufacturers or chemical companies or oil and gas companies or agribusiness or defense contractors or the nuclear industry, let me tell you something. It's no different than it was hundreds of years ago. The political system, the status quo of today, isn't going to rise up and say, we'll fix it. They're not the answer. They are the problem. It is time, once again, for the people to start. Paradigm in 1776. It is time to repudiate it. I'm running for President of the United States because I challenged the idea that only those whose careers have been entrenched for decades in that system that drove us into this ditch are somehow the only people qualified to drive us out of the ditch. No. That makes no sense whatsoever. We have been fooled. It's very tempting in a way to think, well, the problem is Donald Trump. It's not so much that Donald Trump created the problem created Donald Trump. As soon as we started making the businessman some false god, then it was almost inevitable that the most perverse, twisted form of that notion would arise. And so what we need to do is prosecute more than a case against Donald Trump. We have to prosecute a case against the system that produced him. And that is what I am doing with my campaign, and I hope you'll help me. Because if all we do is defeat Donald Trump, and we must defeat Donald Trump at the polls in 2020, nothing could be more important.
But we have to do more than just defeat Donald Trump. Because if we do not transform the conditions that produced him, then those same forces will be back in full force in 22, they'll be back in full force in 24. We need to do more than keep this country from falling over the cliff. We have to get out of the vicinity of the cliff entirely. And we have been in the vicinity of the cliff for quite a while. We've been headed towards this cliff for the last 40 years. And I particularly, because I am here at Multiversity, because I do understand the work of Hive and other organizations that have come here, and because I myself am someone who has grown both philosophically, spiritually, and professionally out of the larger gestalt of people seeking the kind of generative new possibilities and new ideas that places such as this represent. I think it's very important that we ourselves have an important conversation about the parts we've played in making things better and the parts that we have played in perhaps acquiescing to systems that turned out to be just more of the problem in new form. You see, I grew up in a generation where we read Alan Watts and Ram Dass in the morning, and then we went to Vietnam anti-war protests in the afternoon. So I grew up in a generation where the internal changes and cultural revolution and political changes were interlaced. They were not separate. It was changes on the inside and changes on the outside. Everybody understood that. And our great political figures, Martin Luther King, Bobby Kennedy, Eugene McCarthy, these men stood in the public realm and they held forth great philosophical visions within a political context. Many of us who were so enamored of them were young at the time. We were too young to hold the levers of power, but we so admired those who did, and we genuinely saw them as our leaders. They were shot and killed in front of our eyes. And the bullets that assassinated those men psychically shot an entire generation. Because those bullets carried a very loud, unspoken message, and that was this: there will be no further protest. And just in case we didn't totally understand, there was the killing of the students at Kent State, just in case we hadn't gotten the message. And the loud, unspoken message meant that there will be no further protests. You will go home now. You will do whatever you want in the private sector. You can have all the choice that you want. You could have the blue one, you could have the red one, you could have the green one, you could have the yellow one. So much choice. But you will leave the public sector alone. You will leave politics and the public sector to whoever wants it so bad that they are clearly willing to kill in order to control it. And the most brilliant generation of Americans did as we were told. We stepped back. We went into the private sector. We started companies, ideas. We thought of ourselves as revolutionaries. We thought of ourselves as disruptors. But if we look at it now, were we really? Really? Because if all we were doing was coming up with new iterations within a system that was itself determined by someone other than us, then even that idea was just a co-opting. Even that idea was just a cosmetic change. And we could tell ourselves that we're disruptors, and we could tell ourselves that we're doing so much to change things. And yes, we are doing things to change things for people like us. You see, I don't believe that the majority of people in America who have created wealth want to feel that they have created wealth or are creating wealth or could create wealth at the expense of other people having the opportunity to. And yet that is what has happened in the last 40 years in this country. Trickle-down economics, the very idea that all that a corporation owes is fiduciary responsibility to its own stockholders, the idea that all that a corporation has to do is serve that stockholder value, even when that is at the expense of the larger stakeholders, even when that's at the expense of the worker, or the expense of the community, or the expense of the environment. And the idea was that all that money that was then accrued to the stockholder class would trickle down and it would lift all boats. And so what has happened after 40 years, and after 40 years I think it's safe to say the jury is in. This economic philosophy has not lifted all boats. It has left millions of people without even a life vest. And it has left millions of people living in chronic economic anxiety. And it has left 1% of Americans owning more wealth than the bottom 90%. It has left 40% of all Americans struggling on any given day to deal even with the psychological and emotional debilitation of knowing what will happen if I get sick? What will happen if my children get sick? How will I send my children to college, and how will I pay off my college loans? And then even within communities such as ours, we have tried to make a difference within the private domain. We have come up with ideas about how a corporation could be more conscious, how we could take better care of our workers and so forth. We have come up with great plans for charity. But ladies and gentlemen, we must break through to the next step now. No amount of charity can compensate for a basic lack of social justice. As wonderful as it is to be here, as wonderful as it is to be a multiversity, as much as it is to be in the most wonderful places with the most wonderful food and the coolest people talking about how we're disrupting, we're not disrupting until we go into politics. Help me, let's win the president. In Nevada, people in South Carolina, and people in New Hampshire have been very clear that they are the deciders, have been very, very clear that they are the early primary states, and who they vote for, who they caucus for, who they primary for, this is what will determine who will be the nominee of their political party. The truth is that things have changed. Californians are sort of used to being so far down the line that your enthusiasm didn't really matter, because by the time things got to California, the decision would almost be made. This has changed now. And even though Californians know this, I get the feeling many Californians haven't really integrated what it means. When the caucuses take place on February 3rd in 2020, on that day, that will also be the first day that Californians can do early voting. This means, in effect, that actually California is, for all intents and purposes, now an early primary state. When I say help me, I mean literally help me, and we believe this. Now, we have a problem on our hands, and we have a situation that we thought we would not be seeing in this country. Several decades ago, we thought that we had reached a consensus. No intelligent observer thought we didn't have bigots or racists or homophobes or anti-Semites or Islamophobes or xenophobes in our country. Obviously, we've always had them. But we thought we had reached a consensus several decades ago that there were lines past which we would not go. We thought we had reached a consensus that on neither left or right, Democrat or Republican, or any other major field of political power, would any one of those forces be given a major megaphone. Clearly, those levees have fallen, partly because of the power of social media, and also because we have a person of power no less forceful than the President of the United States, who is not above stoking those forces for his own political purposes. As a consequence, we are now facing and dealing with something in the United States that is one of the most dangerous phenomena that can beset human civilization, and that is collectivized hatred. Now, the problem is not that there are more people that hate than love in America. There are way more people who love than hate. There is no question in my mind about that. But those who hate today in America hate with conviction. And conviction is a force multiplier. So the problem is not the more people hate than love. The problem is that those who hate with a conviction that is greater than that which is now being displayed by those who love. We need to love with as much conviction as is now displayed by those. Out of our comfort zone sometimes. That means you have to do more than just love your own children. It means you have to do more than just love your own tribe. It means you have to as deeply love the children on the other side of town. That means you have to as deeply love the children on the other side of the world. That means you can't just love when it's convenient. That's one thing you have to say about a terrorist. You can't doubt their dedication. I can't imagine a kind of sort of sometimes when it's convenient committed terrorist. These people are very, very clear about what they want, and that they are planning to do whatever it takes to effectuate their worldview. Some of us, however, and I include myself among them, I've been here as much as anyone I know, kind of, sort of, sometimes when it's convenient, committed to love. And that will not do. We must stand up for love now, even beyond this environment. We must stand up for love now, even beyond our own personal comfort zones. We must stand up for love now, beyond our own tribe. We must stand up for love now, beyond anything that any of us have ever done before. If you want to save this country, if you want to truly nurture the ideals and the aspirational principles of American democracy, if you really want to rebond with the psychological and spiritual and emotional importance to all of the world of the liberal principles of American democracy, if you want to do this in a way that is as powerful and as potent and as meaningful as any generation before us has done, as powerful as what the abolitionists did, as powerful as what the suffragettes did, as powerful as what the civil rights workers did, so powerful that it will even defeat Donald Trump in 2020 and completely transform this country, you can't just do it part-time. This is our time. It's our time for our revolution of consciousness. It is time for our generation to stand up. I know life has been good. I know there's a lot to do. I know you've got a lot of trauma work you're working on. But none of us, we cannot wait until you finish your trauma work to show up for your country. They didn't know if they were going to bring the dogs out. They didn't know if they were going to bring the hoses out. They didn't know if they were going to bring the bullets out. You think the women's suffragettes who marched just so that women could have the right to vote and were thrown in prison for doing so, and the conditions in the prison were so awful that they went on a hunger strike, and the prison officials responded to that by sending in guards to force these metal contraptions around their necks to force them to eat. You think they weren't a little tense and anxious about the whole thing? Sure they were. We have so much. Now we must have courage. We have so much. We have an immoral political agenda that is now the agenda of the President of the United States. But I don't believe that this president will be beaten by an insider political game. He is not just a politician, he's a phenomenon. An insider political game will not defeat him. He will only be defeated by another phenomenon. We have to create a phenomenon of equal power. You think a phenomenon of hate is powerful? Nothing compared to what's going to show up when we create a phenomenon of love. You can only get rid of darkness by turning on the light. And you can't get rid of hatred by answering with hatred. You can only get rid of hatred by answering it with love. You cannot defeat dog whistles. You have to drown them out with a more beautiful song. And that is what each of us must sing today. That is what we must do. We must create something in response to this president's agenda that's more than, well, I really hate that. And that's more than, well, what he's doing is immoral. It's really wrong. No, that will not do it. This is bigger than that. We must respond to an immoral politics with a moral politics. And too often, the Democratic Party itself, I always feel I'm not running against anyone. I'm running with a lot of really fine people. None of this is personal. They're all really great people actually running for this office. And I'm not saying that any of them are lying. They're telling the truth. But I want to point out that when you raise your hand and you take an oath in a court of law in the United States, you do not just take an oath to tell the truth. You take an oath to tell the whole truth and nothing but the truth. And that is why I'm running. Because the only thing that will defeat lies is big truth. We have to do more than tell the truth. We need to get real about this country. We need to get real about the underbellies of this country. We need to tell the whole truth and nothing but the truth. We need to put it on the table, face where we're not who we say we are, answer to history in the ways that we need to still make things right. Just like when a Catholic goes to confess confession, just like a Jew on the day of Yom Kippur confessing their sins, just like someone in an AA meeting who knows I have to admit the exact my character defects. I have to take a serious moral inventory. Ladies and gentlemen, this country needs to do that. We need to be honest about where we're not who we say we are. We need to be honest about the gaps between our principles and our recent behavior. We need to be honest about our national character defects. We need to be honest about the places where we need to atone for past mistakes. We need to be honest about the places where we need to make amends. We need to make those amends. We have to have generative imagination. We need to close one chapter. We need to open another one. We need to take all the genius of communities like this and put them in the service of generating a new possibility for America. If I may say so, I'm a woman for that job. Number one, moral economics. Our system is not one in which a few people sit around and talk about how they might make life miserable for millions and millions of people. That's not how it works. It's just that a human being that has no remorse and has no sense of empathy and has no sense of kindness and compassion and ethical responsibility to others is called a sociopath. And an economic system which does not factor in any way and does not think it needs to, any sense of moral responsibility, ethical responsibility, empathy, or kindness or compassion for other people, for the people of the world, for the stakeholders, for the earth itself, is a sociopathic economic system. Yeah. And a sociopathic economic system puts short-term profits for a few people before advocacy for the people of our country and of our world and of the planet itself. This is an amoral economic system which currently has immoral consequences. It is not going to get any better of itself. It is progressive. The word inertia means the tendency of the object to be moving in whatever direction it's been moving. This will not change without a fundamental pattern disruption of the economic, social, and political status quo of our time. That is why a political system or a political candidacy that says, we're going to tweak it a little here, we're going to tweak it a little there, we're going to come up with solutions that work, we're going to have an incremental change or a policy change here. It's like, oh, we're going to take so many knives to that gunfight. No, ladies and gentlemen. We are not fools. We have been trained to expect too little. We have been trained to ask for too little. We have been trained out of our power, and in too many ways we have acquiesced and even conspired to our own disempowerment. We have become, as citizens, mere spectators. It's like to a game, like to a sports event. And citizens are now treated, voters are treated by the conventional political establishment like poker chips. You have a few over here, you have a few over there. And then it's so exploitative and it's so corrupt. I'm going to tell you what I think you want, so you'll vote for me. I'm going to tell you what you want, so you'll vote for me. I'm going to tell you what I think you want, so you'll vote for me. I'm not saying any of that stuff. I don't want to go to Washington and fight for you. I want to go to Washington and co-create with you. I'm not saying what I'm going to do for you. I'm going to say together, we can save this country. A virulent strain of capitalism. Now, I consider myself a capitalist. There is a big conversation now, can capitalism is it inherently without conscience? I don't believe that. That's not my opinion. But I respect those who think differently. It's that a virulent strain of capitalism has set in. The whole idea that corporations without any sense of ethical responsibility to other stakeholders besides its stockholders, we must end this pattern. That is why we must repeal that 2017 $2 trillion tax cut that gave 83 cents of every dollar to the very richest individuals and corporations. We need to put back in the middle class tax cut. We need to stop those subsidies, $26 billion to oil and gas. Yeah. What for? We pay 10 times more to oil and gas than we pay to education. Martin Luther King used to say, if they give it to rich people, they call it a subsidy. If they give it to poor people, they call it a handout. How insulting is that? Not only that, but we also have a situation where our own government, You know, big pharmaceutical companies paid last year alone $284 million in lobbying of Congress. Even oil and gas only paid $125 million. And when these huge entities pay all those millions of dollars in corporate donations, they're not doing it to be charitable. They want a quid pro quo. And they got their quid pro quo several years ago when our own legislators legislated against our own best interests and gave away the power of the U.S. government to negotiate with big pharmaceutical companies for lower prices. You may be president. That is now. Even though I certainly have great respect for the U.S. military, my father fought in World War II, and we will talk about that in a few minutes. Even though the military should have every cent that our military claims that it needs for legitimate security purposes, ladies and gentlemen, there are those who claim that anywhere from $100 billion to $300 billion are spent above that. Above what the military says that they need, not because America needs it to be safe, but in order to increase profits for defense contractors, short-term corporate profits for defense contractors. You know, you stop doing all that nonsense, plus you put a 3% tax on the assets of billionaires and a 2% tax on the asset of everybody, 50 million and over. Guess what? We'll have some cash on hand, and we will do the right thing. Ready to do the right thing. Let me tell you the things we're going to do. We're going to face all the places where we are not who we should be, and that begins with America's children. We have millions of American children who go to school every single day in classrooms that do not even have adequate supplies with which to teach a child to read. If a child cannot learn to read by the age of 8, the chances of high school graduation are drastically decreased, and the chances of incarceration are drastically increased. We have millions of American children who live in what are called America's domestic war zones, where the PTSD of a returning veteran from Afghanistan or Iraq is considered no more severe than the PTSD of these children. We have 13 to 15 million children who are food insecure. We have children in the United States who go to school every single day and ask the teachers if maybe you have some food for me. We have children in the United States who are traumatized before preschool. We are among very, very few nations who base our educational funding on property taxes. What that means is that if a child is raised in a well-to-do neighborhood, the chances of that child having a very fine public school education is very high. But if that child is not raised in an advantaged neighborhood, then that child does not have the same chance of a high-quality education. If you want to see the genius of the American spirit, if you want to see the entrepreneurial potential of the American, if you want to see the power that could fuel the most amazing 21st century, I'll tell you where it is. It is in the brain of every kindergartner in every neighborhood in the United States. If you want to there are millions and billions and possibly trillions of dollars of unrealized economic potential that lies in the fact that we fail to help every single child self-actualize. And if I'm President of the United States, we will have a United States Department of Children and Youth. We will have a massive realignment of our investment in the direction of our children 10 years old and younger. Every school in America will be a palace of learning and culture and the arts. It will not be the case that the rich kids get a good education and everybody else, well, let's hope so. And we'll raise $50,000 here or there for inner cities. We'll raise $100,000 here or there for inner cities. Maybe we'll even raise $1 million and we'll feel so good about ourselves because we were charitable. That needs to stop, not only in this society, but even in ourselves. And we need to realize it is a national priority, that it is a commitment in our Declaration of Independence that God gave all people, and that includes children, the right to life, to liberty, to the pursuit of happiness. Governments are instituted to secure those rights. This government isn't doing that. We need to change. Children in the United States are like a vast sea of unnecessary suffering. It is as though we have simply normalized their despair. That's what our political establishment has done. And that's because they're not old enough to vote, so they're not a constituency, and they're not old enough to work, so they don't have any financial leverage. So what possible clout, how possible, is it for them to compete with the clout of all that corporate money that has turned our government into little more than a legalized system of bribery? What we will do is to recognize that when you withhold, if you're the richest country in the world, and you are withholding education from a child who for no other reason than their financial circumstances cannot afford to provide that education for themselves, that is a passive form of oppression. That is what that is. And we are practicing as a country passive child neglect. And to all of the women in this room, remember, we didn't get power just to use it for ourselves. We got power in order to stand for the uniquely feminine values that make us women. And you know what? Our economic system was designed by men. It was designed by men before women had a voice in the public realm. It was designed not only before women had a voice in the public realm, but before the time, as is true now, when so many men were home with their young children to see the brilliance of a young child. We are simply continuing to perpetuate an economic system which saw children as invisible. All the children were little potential workers. We need to reimagine. We need to see a politics and an economics for the 21st century, which is in alignment with the truth of who we are. Some people say that I'm very naive. All this business when I talk about how all public policy, domestic and international, should be aligned with that which makes people thrive. Because when people thrive, that's how you get peace. That's how you get prosperity. Help people thrive. Don't cap their dreams and release their dreams. And that will get Some people say I'm very naive. Some people say all this love stuff. She thinks we can just let love rule the world. She's very naive. Let me tell you something. I'll tell you who's naive. What's naive is to think that we will continue to exist for another 100 years on this planet if we do not make that choice. And that is why so many of the great social justice movements in this country have derived from spiritual and religious forces. Because a spiritual vision of things gives you the power to own your no and own your yes. It is the religious and the spiritual forces who see wrong and say that's enough. There's your boundary, there's your no. Sometimes love says no. If you have a child and your child wants to do something destructive this weekend, love says no. And that's why we need to see so many things going on in our country and in our world, own our power and say no. But we have more than that. We also have the power to say yes. The power to say yes to things unseen. The power to say yes the same way our founders did. We're not going to do it that way. We're going to do it this way. That's the generative spirit. That's the rambunctiousness. That's the healthy rebellion of the American. We see that. We get that that's what is, but we're Americans, so we don't have to settle for that. Just like when you're a parent, and you find yourself saying things that you never thought you would say, that your parents used to say. I remember the first time I heard the sentence come out of my mouth to my daughter. Why? Because I said so. I couldn't believe it. That's how we need to get as citizens. We need to own that. These changes are going to happen. Why? Because we said so. That is what we're doing. So not only do we say enough is enough, with a system that just allows children to suffer so unnecessarily. We're not going to stop there either, because we know that we have to go all the way. We have to get deep, we have to get real, we have to get honest, and we have to make changes. And the next area I want to mention is race. I don't think that the average American is racist. That's not my experience, it's not my belief. But the average American is woefully undereducated about the history of race in the United States. It was in 1619 that the first enslaved persons were brought to this country. And slavery was not abolished until 1865. That's just short of 250 years. That was then followed by another 100 years of institutionalized violence against black people in America. What do you call lynchings and Ku Klux Klan and segregation, if not domestic terror? What do you call the black code laws that were passed by legislatures all over the South to ensure subpar economic and social and political opportunities for black people? That is its own form of institutionalized oppression. You put the 250 years of slavery together with that 100 years between the abolition of slavery and the civil rights movement, that's 350 years of institutionalized violence against black people. That's longer than this country has been in existence. In 1964, we passed the Civil Rights Act. The Civil Rights Act dismantled segregation. In 1965, they passed the Voting Rights Act. The Voting Rights Act ensured equal voting opportunities to black people. But as of 2013, the John Roberts Supreme Court has chipped away at the Voting Rights Act, which is why all the spate of voter suppression efforts are all over the country. When slavery was abolished in 1865, Tecumseh Sherman, General Sherman, promised to every former slave family of 40 acres and a mule. We've all heard that phrase, but please think about what that would have meant. You were an enslaved person. Now you're told you're not a slave any longer, you're free. Where are you supposed to go? What are you supposed to do? How are you supposed to feed yourself? How are you going to feed your children? And now you have a South, boy, you think they hated you before, they really hate you now. And so what we did was to promise that 40 acres and a mule. Then, in the vast majority of cases, the promise was taken away. They weren't given it. Even when they were given it, most of the time it was taken away. So that horrifying economic gap that existed at the end of the Civil War has never fundamentally, systemically been addressed. Ladies and gentlemen, I'm not saying we haven't done anything, because we have done much. We had the Civil Rights Movement, we had the Civil War, but I think that we would all agree, if you've been kicking somebody to the ground, and I think 350 years is definitely kicking somebody to the ground, you have a moral responsibility to do more than to just stop kicking. You have a moral responsibility to say, here, let me help you get it. About it in Iowa, when I've talked about it in New Hampshire, people stand up just like you just did. People applaud because we're good and decent people. I'm not saying Americans are better than other people. I don't think we're better than other people, but we're good, we're decent, and we want to feel that we are doing the right thing. The Civil Rights Movement was a big thing. It is time for the Americans to do big things again. We're not tired because we're doing too much. We're tired because we're doing too little. We're tired because we're not doing the big things. That is why we need to pay reparations for slavery. That is why we need a Green New Deal. That is why we need to commit as a generation to the reversal of climate change. That is why we need to know we don't do little incremental things. We do big things. We are going to pay reparations for slavery. We are going to take the appropriate reparative actions to Native Americans, because for a country, just like for an individual, you cannot open to an unlimited future until and unless you clean up your past. Chapters and the opening to a new one. I do not see reparations for slavery as a black agenda. I see it as an American agenda. Germany has paid $89 billion in reparations to Jewish organizations since World War II. That doesn't mean that the Holocaust didn't happen, but it has gone far towards establishing reconciliation between Germany and the Jews of Europe. In 1988, Ronald Reagan signed the American Civil Liberties Act, whereby every surviving prisoner from the Japanese internment camps was given between $20,000 and $22,000. The idea of one people that has wronged another paying economic restitution is not a fringe idea. It should not be treated like a fringe idea. And let me tell you why I disagree with other candidates who say, well, we really should have a study about this. We should have a study about this. We should gather the evidence about this. I don't know about you. The evidence is there already for me. And some people say that we should have race-based policies, that is what reparations should be. They should be in the form of race-based policies. Let me tell you why I disagree with that. Race-based policies leaves open the question, whose fault it is it that this gap exists to begin with? The reason I like reparations is because it has an inherent mea culpa. It carries moral force. because it is an inherent acknowledgement of a wrong that has been done, a debt that is owed, and the willingness on the part of a people to pay it. It will not fix everything, but it will release economic power, of course, but much more than that. It will release psychological power, spiritual power, and emotional power. Let us give this gift to our children and to our grandchildren. The war was over in 1865. We continue to pass along this painful baton of karmic toxicity and debt and burden and guilt. Let's do something big so our children can begin again. And there's one more issue in terms of the interface of our more transformational principles with our political situation, and that has to do with our national security. As I said at the beginning, America has never totally actualized the principles on which we purport to stand. But at our best, we've tried. And I lived in this country at a time when there was a consensus that we were supposed to. So it wasn't like even in my lifetime we ever got it right, but it was a general consensus that when we weren't getting it right, we were supposed to try. And that's the worst thing going on in this country today. It's not even a general consensus that we're supposed to try. So we, for the sake of a $350 billion arms sale to Saudi Arabia, are giving aerial support to a genocidal war. We're doing this. We are giving aerial support to a genocidal war that Saudi Arabia is waging against Yemen. Tens of thousands of people have starved because of this war, many of them children. And we're sitting here talking about disrupting things, but we're not mentioning that. We're talking about disrupting things, but we're not talking about all those millions of children. Our national security agenda is driven as much by short-term profits for defense contractors in the nuclear industry as it is not only by advocacy for world peace, but by any moral leadership, any concept of moral leadership. You take that war against Yemen and America's involvement in that by giving aerial support, it would make our grandparents roll over in their graves. And let me tell you something else that would make our grandparents roll over in their graves. To think we're not even saying anything. You see, you can't just take medicine, you have to cultivate health. We understand that integrated model of healing our bodies. We have to apply that same integrated model to healing our society. You can't just take medicine, you have to cultivate health. Sickness is the absence of health. Health isn't the absence of sickness. And so we can't just endlessly prepare for war, so maybe we'll somehow back up into peace. We can't just endlessly prepare for war. We have to actively wage peace. I'm presently not fit to have a department. $750 billion. Our State Department budget is $40 billion. Within the State Department is a $17 billion expenditure on the USAID, which is humanitarian assistance. And within the State Department budget is a little bit less than $1 billion for peace building. And then the independent U.S. Institute of Peace gets $1.6 million. Now, how do you wage peace? Well, the function of the State Department is diplomacy and development and mediation. And the peace-building agencies are those who carry out with sophisticated expertise, no less sophisticated, no less expert than that which is carried out by military. They do the things which statistically factor in the probability of a greater incidence of peace and a reduced incidence of violence. And for every dollar that we spend on these peace-building efforts, we save over $1,000 on the need to address the conflicts that otherwise arise. And none of these factors are going to surprise you. Number one, expand economic opportunities for women. Expand educational opportunities for children. Number three, reduce violence against women. And number four, reduce human suffering wherever possible. We should see large groups of desperate people as a national security security risk, whether in a corner of the city or in a corner of the world. We should realize the psychological and emotional, obvious common sense fact that desperate people do desperate things. Desperate people, therefore, are more vulnerable to ideological capture by genuinely psychotic forces. That is why in the Williamson administration, the people who are the peace builders, the person who is the head of the USAID, humanitarian assistance, these people will not be peripheral. They'll have a seat at the table. They will be as powerful as any cabinet leader. When we're talking about the national security of this country, it will not be a bunch of just military people and geopolitical analysts. They have gotten us to where we are. It is time to generate new ideas. It is time for the peace builders to have an equal seat at the table, for us to think as much about waging peace as how we will wage war, if in fact we must do that. And we must do that if we must do that. I see the U.S. military as like a surgeon. Of course, we must have the best surgeon on hand, but everybody knows you only have surgery if you need to. Ladies and gentlemen, it is so naive of us, it is so foolish of us to think that every dollar that we spend on the U.S. military is actually for our legitimate security needs, when in fact we spend so much more than the military says that they actually need. It is time for us to ask ourselves, why is it that only I and Tulsi Gabbard are even talking about this stuff, and you might answer it yourself and for yourself. Ladies and gentlemen, this is just one more area. If it's going to change, it's going to be because the people step in. Fox News had done a thing about my Department of Peace idea. They didn't speak about it sarcastically. They didn't speak about it snarkily. They talked about how it was a proposal I had for a Department of Peace. It's been fascinating over the last few months watching people process my existence. Some of the emotional and psychological difficulties are hard. But I've kept going because of people like yourself. People have sent money, people have given me words of encouragement, people have gotten their friends to donate. We're in there. Yes. The door has been silent. I see my campaign like a bonsai tree. It's just like every other tree, it's just not as big because he's got these little. We'll be so excited because we have 3 field organizers in the state, which is really cool, but in other campaigns they have, 29, 30, 35 field organizers or more. But ladies and gentlemen, I hope you feel as I do, that we are talking about things that matter. Yes. Martin Luther King said, your life begins to end on the day you stop talking about things that matter. I don't wake up in the morning and ask myself, what should I say to get this group to like me or that group to like me? I wake up in the morning and I think, dear God, help me articulate the things which need to be said. And that is what I'm trying to do. I hope that you believe that that is what I am doing. And when I get it wrong, I hope you can see that I'm trying my best. If I got it wrong at 10 a.m., that I'm trying to get it right by 11 p.m. I'm doing my best, and I'm so grateful to all of you who supported me. And I will say this, I am in this to whatever extent you help me be in it. This is not just about me, this is about all of us. You have a responsibility to listen to all of the candidates. They're all really good people saying really good things. It is your civic responsibility to listen to all of the candidates and to think about these things yourself. If you feel what I'm saying and what I'm standing for and what I will do as president is aligned with your heart, if you agree with me, as FDR said, that the primary responsibility of the presidency is not the administrative aspect. He said that role is secondary. He said the primary aspect is moral leadership. If you agree with me that there are many kinds of expertise, and as much as I have great respect for political expertise, there are other kinds of expertise. I have respect for the qualifications of my fellow candidates. I don't have some of their qualifications. They don't have my qualifications. Yeah! You can have the best car mechanic in the world, that the car mechanic, even the best, doesn't necessarily know what road we should be taking from here.
Yeah.
That is what I bring to this process. I have a sense, based on my understanding of the road that has taken us to where we are, based on my understanding of people, having been up close and personal with people in crisis for the last 35 years, having a sense of what it takes to transform crisis into opportunity, knowing that the same psychological and emotional processes that guide a journey of one individual's life guide the journey of a nation, because all that a nation is a group of people. If you believe, as I do, that that kind of vision and that kind of understanding is what we need in a presidency in the 21st century, if you do agree with me that that is true, I hope you will support me. I hope you will generate that idea in a field of power that is very, very, very significant. Like I've said, we will not beat this president just with an insider political game. We must create a new possibility. We must create a new transformative vision. We must create a new transformative politics. We must create a new phenomenon based on the fact that love, not just economic principles, should be society's bottom line. We must end a chapter of human history that is driven by a love of power and usher in a chapter of human history that is based on the power of love. If you believe that our love for our children, if you believe that our love for our earth, if you believe that love for future generations, if you believe that love for democracy, if you believe that love for each other, if you believe that love for the world itself and all that it can be is actually the basis of a new possibility such as has never been created, if you believe that even though it's the 11th hour, it's not midnight yet, if you believe that like every other time in history, even when Americans have been slow to wake up, we slam it like nobody's business when we do wake up, and if you believe that our generation, which admittedly has been asleep for quite a while in far too many ways, that we're ready to wake up and we're ready to harness that awakening and slam it like nobody's business, please join with me. Marianne 2020.